My psychopath mother assaulted me and took me to court over $3. She lost, then vandalized the house I was renting to her. I had her evicted and admitted to a psych ward for what she did after. I own a small house, and my parents have always really wanted to live in it rent-free. My dad is retired, and my mom refuses to work, and after some bargaining, we came to deal. A lease was written stating they'd pay $350 per month, which was the amount needed for me to pay it off. Essentially, I wasn't making a dime on this house. Well, I recently told my mother that rent would go up by $3 because of a slight increase in insurance. My mother lost it. She actually screamed at me, claiming I'm a money-hungry beach, threatened to ruin the garden because of this, and even lunged at me trying to grab my hair. She yelled that I owe her this, that she won't pay the $3, and I can't evict her because it's her house. I finally got her to let go of me and yelled back that she and my dad are listed as tenants. I went to turn around and leave, but she ran past me and blocked the door. "I'm not paying," she yelled again. I was at my wit's end by now and physically pushed her out of the way, then told her to talk to a lawyer about this, because if they refuse to pay, I will evict them. I walked out of the house, and later I heard the news that my mother is divorcing my father because he took my side when she told him about it. A few days later, I found out that my mother had actually gone to a lawyer, insisting that I had no right to raise the rent at all, and was determined to fight the $3 increase in court. The news hit me like a punch to the gut. I couldn't believe that my own mother was willing to drag this through the legal system over such a minor amount of money. It felt surreal, but in my gut, I knew this was just another attempt for her to exert control over the situation, another power play to try and bend things to her will. The whole ordeal of going to court was long and exhausting. My mother showed no sign of backing down, convinced she was entitled to the house. She kept arguing that the house belonged to her, that she had the right to stay there without paying more rent. It was as though the signed lease meant nothing to her. She was focused on portraying herself as the victim, emphasizing how I had betrayed her, how I owed her after everything she had done for me over the years. She made a lot of emotional statements, but none of them held up in front of the judge. The law was clear. A lease was a lease, and my parents were tenants. I was legally allowed to raise the rent to cover rising costs, even if it was just by $3. In the end, the judge ruled in my favor. The case was dismissed, and my mother's claims were rejected. My mother walked out of the courtroom in a cold silence. Her expression was a mix of anger and humiliation, like she couldn't believe what had just happened. She didn't say a word to me, but the silence between us was thick with tension. It felt like I was holding my breath, waiting for the next explosion, knowing it was only a matter of time. A few days passed with no word from her. I thought maybe this would be the end of it. Maybe she would finally accept that she had lost, but that was wishful thinking. My mother wasn't one to let go of something easily, especially when it came to control. It wasn't long before the next wave of drama hit. One afternoon, I got a call from one of the neighbors. They told me that my mother had been in the yard, ripping out plants and destroying the garden. By the time I arrived, the damage had already been done. The garden, which had once been a place of beauty and tranquility, was completely wrecked. Flowers were torn from the ground, pots were smashed, and the small trees I had carefully nurtured were uprooted. It looked like a hurricane had passed through. I stood there for a long time, staring at the destruction. I couldn't believe that my mother had gone this far. Her anger had reached a point where reason no longer mattered. It wasn't about the $3 anymore. It was about proving a point, about trying to control the situation and make sure I felt the weight of her rage. She knew how much the garden meant to me, and tearing it apart was her way of showing me that she could still hurt me, even when she couldn't win in court. I felt a deep sense of betrayal wash over me. This wasn't just a moment of anger or a heated argument. This was deliberate. She had taken the time to come to the house, to rip apart something she knew I cared about, all because she couldn't accept that I had asked for a small rent increase. I couldn't wrap my mind around how far she had gone, how deep her anger had run. It was clear to me now that she wasn't going to stop unless I made her. That night, standing in the ruins of my garden, I realized that I had no choice left. I had been avoiding it, hoping things would get better on their own, but now it was obvious they wouldn't. I had to evict them. I couldn't let my mother stay in the house any longer, not when she was capable of this kind of destruction. The decision weighed heavily on me, but I knew it was the only option left. I filed the eviction paperwork the next morning. The process felt cold and impersonal, like a final severing of the bond between us. But I had to do it. My mother had pushed me to this point, and there was no going back. When the eviction notice was finally delivered, my mother's reaction was as explosive as I had expected. She came to my house, pounding on the door, screaming about how I had betrayed her, how I owed her, how she would never leave. I didn't open the door. I couldn't face her in that state. I called the police, and they came to remove her from the property. As she was led away, she shouted that I would regret this, that she would make sure I paid for what I had done. Her words cut deep, but I didn't react. I was too tired. The whole situation situation had drained me, and I couldn't keep engaging with her anger. I just wanted it to be over. The court process for the eviction dragged on, but eventually the judge ruled in my favor once again. My parents were given 30 days to vacate the house. I knew my father would comply, but my mother was a different story. She refused to leave quietly. In the days leading up to their departure, she made the house unbearable. She scrawled hateful messages on the walls, left trash scattered throughout the rooms, and continued to try to intimidate me with phone calls and threats. The day they finally moved out, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. My father left without saying much. He seemed broken, defeated. I helped him find a small apartment nearby. And although he was grateful, it was clear that the divorce and the fallout with my mother had taken a toll on him. This wasn't how he had pictured his retirement, and the guilt weighed on me, even though I knew this situation wasn't my fault. After they left, the house felt empty and cold. It had once been a place of comfort, but now it was just a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. I spent the next few weeks cleaning up the mess they had left behind. I fixed what I could, but some of the damage was too deep to simply cover up. The hateful words scrawled on the walls had left a mark, not just on the house, but on me as well. After my parents left the house, I spent weeks cleaning and trying to restore it to some kind of normalcy. The hateful words my mother had scrawled on the walls were the first thing I tackled. I scrubbed and painted over them, trying to erase the anger that had been embedded into the house. Every room felt like a reminder of the battle that had taken place here, but I knew I couldn't dwell on it forever. The garden was next. I replanted the flowers she had ripped out, filled the pots with new soil, and tried to bring back the peace the space once gave me. It wasn't just about repairing the physical damage. This was a way for me to move forward. But despite my best efforts to distance myself from the situation, my mother wasn't done causing chaos. About a month after the eviction, I got a call from the police. They had arrested my mother for trespassing. Apparently, she had been seen wandering around the property late at night, looking through windows, pacing the yard. A neighbor had called the police, worried about her erratic behavior. I wasn't surprised when I got the call. Her anger had always made her unpredictable, but the idea of her lurking around the house at night unsettled me. I thought back to her threats, the way she had shouted that I would never get rid of her, and it made sense. She couldn't let go. The police told me they had picked her up and taken her in for questioning. They didn't keep her long, just a few hours, but the incident made me realize that her mental state might be worse than I thought. She had never been like this before, at least not to this extent. Her anger had always been sharp, but I hadn't seen this level of obsession and instability. Not long after the trespassing incident, I began to notice other signs that something was off. My father, who had been mostly quiet since the eviction, confided in me that my mother had been acting increasingly erratic. He mentioned that she had started losing touch with reality, obsessing over the house, over me, and over the way her life had unraveled. He said that she was convinced I was out to get her, that I was plotting against her. He didn't know what to do, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes when he talked about her. Then one evening, I got another call. This time, it was from my Aunt Karen. She told me that my mother had been admitted to a psychiatric ward. After the arrest for trespassing, her behavior had continued to spiral, and she had started lashing out at anyone who tried to help her. My aunt had taken her to the hospital after a particularly violent outburst, and they decided to admit her for further evaluation. According to Aunt Karen, my mother was completely unresponsive, alternating between anger and deep depression. She was convinced that everyone was against her, and she had become a danger not only to herself, but to those around her. Hearing that my mother was in a psych ward filled me with a strange mix of emotions. Part of me felt guilty, as though I had somehow pushed her to this point, even though I knew that wasn't true. Another part of me felt relief, knowing that at least she was somewhere safe, where she couldn't continue to harm herself or others. It was strange to think of my mother in a place like that. She had always been so strong-willed, so controlling. The idea of her being helpless in a hospital felt surreal. A few weeks passed, and my father and I stayed in touch, trying to support each other through the aftermath of everything that had happened. He visited her at the hospital, but I didn't go. I couldn't bring myself to see her like that, not yet. I needed time to process everything, to come to terms with the fact that my mother had spiraled so far out of control. Then, one day, I got another call. This time, it was from the hospital. My mother had been discharged. They said that while she wasn't fully stable, she had shown enough improvement to be released. I wasn't sure what to think. On one hand, I was glad she was doing better, but on the other, I worried that it was too soon. I wasn't ready to deal with her again. I wasn't ready for whatever came next. After her release, my mother moved into a small apartment near Aunt Karen's house. I didn't visit her, but I heard from my aunt that she was trying to get her life back together. She was seeing a therapist regularly and was on medication to help manage her anger and paranoia. It was a slow process, and while she wasn't back to her old self, she was at least making progress. A few months went by, and life settled into a strange kind of normal. I spent my days working on the house, continuing to rebuild the parts of it that had been damaged, both physically and emotionally. My father and I saw each other regularly, but my mother remained a distant figure in my life. I wasn't sure if I would ever be ready to reconnect with her. The wounds were still too fresh. But then, one evening, I got a call that changed everything. My mother had been arrested again. This time, it wasn't for trespassing. She had gone back to the house, broken in through one of the windows, and had started tearing apart the garden once again. The neighbors had called the police, and when they arrived, they found her in the middle of the yard, screaming and pulling up plants, just like before. They took her away in handcuffs, and I knew that this time, things had gone too far. I went to the police station the next day to find out what was going on. They told me that my mother had been charged with vandalism and trespassing, and that she was being held for a psychiatric evaluation. This time, it wasn't just about the house or the rent or the $3 increase. This was about her mental health, about the fact that she had lost control of herself and her actions. The court process for her vandalism charge took several months, but in the end, the judge ruled that she needed to be committed to a long-term psychiatric facility. It wasn't just a temporary stay this time. This was a more permanent solution. The doctors had determined that her mental state was too unstable for her to live on her own, and she was a danger not only to herself but to others as well. Hearing that my mother would be committed to a psychiatric facility brought a sense of finality to everything that had happened. It was heartbreaking in a way, but it was also a relief. I knew that she was in the right place now, where she could get the help she needed. But at the same time, it felt like the last thread connecting us had been cut. She wasn't the same person anymore, and I wasn't sure if she ever would be again. In the months following her commitment, I focused on rebuilding my life. My father continued to live nearby, and we grew closer as time went on. We both carried the weight of what had happened with my mother, but we didn't talk about it much. It was an unspoken understanding between us. That chapter of our lives was over, and we had to move on. The house, once filled with so much tension and anger, had finally become a place of peace again. I had replanted the garden for the second time, and the flowers bloomed brighter than ever before. The house felt like mine again, no longer haunted by the memories of the past. As for my mother, I received updates from my aunt every now and then. She was doing as well as could be expected in the psychiatric facility, but I didn't visit her. I wasn't ready to face her, and I wasn't sure if I ever would be. The distance between us had grown too wide, and while I hoped she would find some peace in her own life, I had to focus on finding it in mine.